Talking about competing visions of democracy, looking at the 20th century in the United States, when there was an explosion of this discussion of what democracy means. As the United States in the 20th century, remember, moved from a largely agrarian society to a largely urban society. As it moved from the world that we knew in the period of the American Revolution to the newer industrial world. Right? Population growing, people concentrating in cities, things getting more complex. The United States entering more and more on the world stage, first in World War I, and then in the second half of the century, moving to a position of world dominance. So the 20th century, lots of discussion of democracy in the context of this rapidly changing world. What does democracy mean? We talk about democracy as meaning rule by the people, but that's a very vague assertion. What does it actually mean in practice? And I said that anytime you start categorizing that kind of complexity, you're going to wash away some of the particularity, some of the complexity, but we can see that there have been two general approaches to democracy. One, to try and constantly expand the amount of participation by ordinary people, what we're calling popular democracy, attempts to bring as many people as possible into the process. Another point of view that says that is a dream that will never be realized, that the complexity of the system is such that the best you can achieve is a kind of managerial democracy where people with skills and expertise, what we're calling elites, come together and they manage the system. And the role of citizen in that particular conception of democracy is not to engage directly in governance, but to ally themselves with one or another group of those elites and turn over to those elites the right to rule, in a sense. Okay. So I put up a couple of quotes from political scientists. Doug Loomis articulating this notion of popular democracy, and in doing that, recognizing that democracy is always changing. Democracy is not a particular set of institutions that you figure out, you put into place, and then all is well. Democracy, he says, is an ideal. It's a project always trying to expand the amount of participation. I put up a quote from Samuel Huntington, another political scientist, who articulates an argument for this managerial democracy. Those are both relatively recent articulations. Loomis, still alive, still writing. Huntington died only recently. I wanted to go back and point out that this is not a new debate. Okay? So there has been this argument about the nature of democracy for a long time, going back even to the Greeks. But again, confining our discussion to the 20th century, I want to put up a couple of quotes from noted writers earlier in the 20th century. This one I thought was interesting as an expression of that notion of popular democracy, also putting it in the context of a almost religious, well, not almost, specifically religious language, talking about it in terms of God. This is not an assertion of any particular faith or conception of God. It's not even necessary that one believe in God in traditional senses to understand what she's saying. But every person sharing in the creative process is democracy. Again, you can see this articulation of a popular democracy. That is our politics and our religion. This writer even saying that in the United States, we've come to accept democracy as not just a system of government, but actually something theological. People are always inquiring into their relation to God. God is the moving force of the world. You can read this. You get a sense of what she's trying to say. That democracy is not this sort of sterile business of politics and experts running things. Democracy is something deeper, something richer, something that is crucial to the fabric of everyday life. This thought calls forth everything that is heroic in us, every power of which we are capable must be gathered to this glorious destiny. This is the true democracy. Again, a very kind of religious fervor in this commitment to a notion of democracy as bringing in as many people as possible. And she finishes up, our rate of progress then, and the degree in which we have actualized the perfect democracy, depend upon our understanding that people have the power of creating. and that they get this power through their capacity to join with others to form a real whole, a living group. This is a woman named Mary Parker Follett. I doubt you've ever heard of her. She was a social worker and an early thinker in what now we would call organizational theory, management theory. How do you make large groups of people work? So here you see in the early 20th century an incredible sense of hope, yes? That even in these large, complex organizations, increasingly urban, right, large cities, how are we going to make democracy work in this context? Mary Parker Follett has no doubt we can do it. We can do it by coming together. There's a sense that ordinary people have the capacity, and coming together they can make this work. That's an expression of this popular democracy from the early 20th century. Let's go to a second writer from exactly the same time period, and someone of equal stature, Walter Lippmann. Walter Lippmann worked most of his life as a journalist, but was also what we might call a public intellectual. He wrote books. He was prominent not only in the world of journalism, but in the world of ideas. And he wrote a number of books that were very important in trying to struggle through notions of democracy in the early 20th century. Walter Lippmann wrote a book called The Phantom Public, in which you see an expression of this managerial democracy. The language is quite different, yes? The individual man does not have opinions on all public affairs. He does not know how to direct public affairs. He does not know what is happening, why it is happening, and what ought to happen. That doesn't seem to express a lot of hope for ordinary people, yes? He's basically saying ordinary people. It's the gendered language, man, of course, is of that period. But he's talking about ordinary people. Again, ordinary people are people like you, yes? We're all just kind of ordinary folks, yes? We're not superheroes. And what he's saying is ordinary folks like you, look around, take a minute, look around, look behind you, look at what these people, you know all these people around you? According to Lippmann, they're not very bright. They can't even know what they want, let alone how the world works. He goes on to say, I cannot imagine how we could know, and there is not the least reason for thinking, as mystical Democrats have thought, that compounding the individual ignorances in masses of people can produce a continuous directing force in public affairs. Well, okay, Mr. Lippmann, I guess we know what he thinks about us, yes? The individual ignorances in the masses. Now, again, if you're not clear on this, that individual ignorance means you. Unless you're special enough to rise to the level of Walter Lippmann and become part of the elite. Then, apparently, ignorance is not a problem.
Professor, but doesn't this take into consideration the time period when literacy rates were lower?
No, I don't think so. The question is, what about time periods? You know, maybe people just weren't as smart. Actually, I think it's just the opposite. If you go back to the early 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century, when this change was happening in the United States, it's true, literacy rates weren't as high, but what you find is a much more vibrant conversation about politics among ordinary people in that period than you find today. If you went back to the late 19th, early 20th century and just went out on the street and talked to people, here's what you'd find. People talked more about politics and knew more about politics. Especially during the heyday of the labor movement. When the labor movement was organizing ordinary people, when ordinary people were getting together to fight for better working conditions, they understood that was a political struggle. It wasn't just a very targeted question about your wages on the job. It was about how power and wealth were distributed in society. And you go back and listen to people talk about life in that period. Very vibrant political discussions among ordinary people. That, in fact, I would argue, is part of why people like Lippmann wanted to argue that the masses were not capable of directing their own lives, because the masses had very different ideas about that distribution of wealth and power. There were radical movements at the grassroots in the late 19th, especially the early 20th century, that were challenging the elites. They were going to people like Lippmann and say, we don't agree with you. We have a different idea about how the world should be organized. And I think part of the managerial democracy argument is a reaction to that expression of public interest in politics. Here we're talking about Lippmann, who's writing in the 1920s. Late 20s, he writes into the 30s. This is a time, remember, when American workers were engaged in very, very active labor organizing. And people in power were scared of it. And so one of the things you might do when you're in power, trying to maintain control, is to argue that the people who are challenging you are not competent to make that challenge. If all of a sudden you all started arguing with me and saying, listen, we don't like the way you've organized this class. We don't like these unscheduled quizzes. We think the textbooks you pick are pretty stupid. We want to organize our own education. Well, one argument I might make is, that's very nice, you're very nice, you're great young people, but you're young, you just don't understand. You're not competent to direct your own education. Right? You need me, you need elite control. So these are the kinds of things that were going on. We could talk about this more, but I want to move on. But I want to point out there's a long-standing push-pull in this. Lippmann is writing at a time in which working people, mainly through labor organizing, were challenging elite control. Remember, Huntington was writing in the early 1970s at a time when the student movement, the civil rights movement, the beginnings of a feminist movement were challenging elite control. So here again, I'm giving you my perspective on this. I think that this assertion of managerial democracy, this notion that people are not competent to run their own lives, often is a response to the assertion of people wanting to do that. It's not an observation that people are ignorant and incompetent. It's in fact a reaction to a period in which people demonstrate their knowledge and competence by challenging power. So again, to go back to the very first conversation we had in this class, I'm presenting to you material that reflects the way I have come to understand the world. I'm presenting to you these two conceptions of democracy, popular and managerial. That's a common way that people talk about different approaches to democracy. But when I come to explain how they operate in the world, I'm demonstrating that I have my own point of view. One more selection to, I think, make this point. And here, again, you'll see that this reflects the way I approach this. Many of you know Bertolt Brecht, the famous German playwright. Brecht was also one of these very politicized artists, much like Ahmed Faiz. A lot of great artists also have a very active political life as well. This is from a poem, a longer poem that Brecht wrote in the 1930s as the Nazis were gathering power. And I think it speaks to this. He says, "Those who take the meat from the table teach contentment. Those for whom the contribution is destined demand sacrifice. Those who eat their fill speak to the hungry of the wonderful times to come." And then the line that I think is relevant to what we're saying here, "Those who lead the country into the abyss call ruling too difficult for ordinary men." Again, the gendered construction of men, we can replace people. Right? "Those who lead the country into the abyss call ruling too difficult for men." That's really the question that we all have to wrestle with. We do live in a large, complex society. It is true that no one of us has the knowledge to run everything, correct? Most of us, for instance, if you put us in charge of the financial department of the city of Austin, oh boy, it would be a mess. You don't want to give me the checkbook. Right? I'd make a mess of the accounting. There are all sorts of things that no one person, most of us, can't accomplish. But the question is not, do we have technical skills? The question is, do we have the capacity to understand our own needs, to learn about them, and then to be part of a process by which we come to collective decisions about how to set priorities? Can we do that? Are ordinary people capable of doing that? If your answer to the question is no, people aren't capable of doing it, then a managerial democracy makes sense. Right? It's actually in the interests of people to provide a structure that can guide the society. If you don't think ordinary people have that capacity, it would be folly to turn over the power to ordinary people. Right? If you believe ordinary people have that capacity, then there's another question. How do you structure the institutions of society to allow that to happen? That's not simple either. Right? To make a claim for one or the other of these positions doesn't lead to simple answers. It's always difficult. All right. So that's to bring together this notion of different kinds of democracy. Question?
Do you separate, people having the capacity to learn from people having the willingness to learn?
That's another question. You might say, okay, ordinary people have the capacity to understand this, but they don't appear to want to. Right? And you'll see cycles in history where that assertion seems to be true. In fact, some people would argue that today is one of those moments. That sure, people can figure it out if they want to, but most people don't want to. They would rather attend to their private concerns rather than become engaged with public concerns. Is that the case? Well, it might be. Let's say that you made that argument today, that people are essentially apathetic. You hear this a lot, yes? Apathy is the political problem. Well, then you have to go forward and ask, where does the apathy come from? Right? Does the apathy come because people are generally satisfied with the state of the union? Are people apathetic because they think things are going well and there's no reason to intervene? Or are people apathetic because they believe the institutions are impenetrable, that the shape of power is such that there's no way to intervene meaningfully? Well, I think what you see is there are cycles in history, especially in U.S. history, of this. Right? Bursts of activism from the grassroots where ordinary people assert themselves, attempts by power to beat that back, periods of quiescence where things seem to be inactive, and then explosions of that again. You can certainly, I just take my own lifetime. I was born in 1958. In 1958, the United States was barely, I would argue, a democratic society. Right? Large swatches of the population, non-white folks, were essentially disenfranchised. Women were relegated to second-class status. There was a vicious, what we often call McCarthyism, anti-communism that completely devastated the left. Free speech really didn't exist in the United States. You could be jailed for expressing dissident opinions. In the late 1950s, it looked pretty grim in this country. Not very democratic, a lot of apathy. Right? What happened within the next decade? In the 1960s, all of that exploded, and people asserted their interest in and ability to organize. I was born in 1958. Within a decade, by 1968, the world was on fire. By 1968, every major system of power in the United States and around the world was being challenged. In the summer of 1968, the government of France almost fell. Students were in the streets. In 1968, Columbia University, one of the elite universities, had to shut down for an entire semester because of student radical activism. Right, in 1968, boy, it was a different world. Right. Now, you might say today, you look on college campuses, not all that much political activity, apathy, y'all just don't want to. Well, maybe. That's for you all to figure out for yourselves. But I doubt that that state of affairs will continue indefinitely. It never has before. All right.